you all for coming.
Yeah.
We're going first, thank you, Maria,
No
because
problem.
we live in La Vita and have to get home tonight. Beth is going to explain the process a little bit.
Yeah.
Go for it.
This is a very basic. So batik, and these are all the paintings you see here, is done with wax, wax-resistant dyes. So, and we usually, for our paintings, we work on cotton. We also have something for scarves. We work on silk and rayon. So, but I made this yesterday for a little demonstration. So this was started out as a piece of white cotton, and I applied wax where I wanted to stay white for the trees, and we used chantings.
Did you do a drawing?
I did a drawing, yes. So I did the drawing, and then we used chantings to apply the wax. So we have a pot of melted wax, and it's paraffin, and then beeswax and microcrystalline wax, which is a synthetic beeswax. And we do different mixtures depending on the effect that we want. So we dip this in the pot, and it works as a pen. So we can apply the wax with that. And these come in all different sizes and all different shapes. So these are chantings. So it's T-J-A-N-T-I-N-G. And it's an Indonesian word. So this is a German chanting. This is Indonesian, which we don't use because the Indonesians work upright like this. We work flat. And so this works very well for applying the wax when you're holding it upright. But if we try to do it flat, it drips all over. So we don't really use this. We just collect them. So, and this is another Indonesian one. And this is a Chinese design, and this is actually our favorite. And for very detailed work, we use a kitskap, which is what they use for Ukrainian Easter eggs. You've probably seen, but we use it for the batiks. So to start with, I waxed this white where I wanted to keep the white. And then I splattered the yellow and green dye on. Then I waxed where I wanted to keep the yellow and green. And then put it in black. So this is the really basic batik, and all of the ones you see in here are done the same way.
Also, this morning, Mayor.
Yes. Oh, we
This
boiled the
was
wax
covered
out.
with wax.
Yes, we boiled the wax
and
out.
I boiled the wax in hot water and got the wax out this morning. So we're back to the cloth, and it's fast. The colours are fast, and they won't fade. Any questions?
Any
about
questions?
The process? It's kind of a complex process. Yes, please.
So do you draw on the fabric? And
draw
if
on the
so,
fabric,
with what?
and we have special pencils that will last through the multiple dye baths, but will come out when we take the wax out. So it's a graphite pencil.
Batik has been around for 2,000 years. It's an ancient Asian process, but just not much practiced in America. Europe knows it because Europe had colonies all over the world, and the Dutch brought it from Indonesia, and the late Brits brought it from Malaysia, and so on. So it's known much better there. We have a gallery in La Vita. We're the only batik gallery in America. It isn't a well-known process. I think probably 60% of the people who come to the gallery have no idea what batik is. Yeah. So it's an uphill push to sell this.
How do you take the wax out?
We either boil, for smaller pieces, we boil it out, and for larger paintings, we take it to a dry cleaner in Pueblo. Yeah, so, yeah.
Just to be safe.
To be safe, and also, I mean, to boil out a big piece, because they weigh a ton after we're done waxing in some of these pieces, and we would need a huge cauldron to do it. So.
What happens with the wax once it's boiled out?
We throw it because we add baking soda to the water because it makes it easier to boil the wax out. And some like Indonesian factories have ways where they can recycle the wax, but we don't, because we've tried not using anything added to the water, but it doesn't work really well for us. And so, so with the baking soda in it, we can't really reuse it, unfortunately.
What's the purpose of the wax?
It's a resist, so it's keeping the dye from going into areas where you don't want it. So you're waxing what you want to keep each time. So first you start with a white piece of cloth, you wax where you want it to stay white. Then you use the lightest color dye, let it dry, wax where you want to keep that. Next, darker dye, so you're working light to dark. So everything on these pieces was waxed except for the last color, which would be the darkest color.
Right, so it's a mechanism of color separation.
Yes,
Yes.
definitely.
Essentially.
Yeah.
It's not dissimilar to Japanese woodblock printing.
Where
okay.
you're separating
Screen
colors.
printing.
Yeah.
Any of these, they're separate screens, separate colors. Separate woodblocks for separate colors.
But this predates those?
Yes.
Yes.
Much older.
Yeah, they
Essentially.
found examples of batik in Egyptian tombs, and then I think it probably, I mean, there's argument over this. You know, it started in Africa probably, where they just used mud as a resist, and of course you could just do one dye because the mud would wash off, but it was
You see
enough
mud
to make a
pits.
print.
Mud cloth is well known. You see brown and black. We've all seen it, and it's just done by smearing with their thumbs mud onto the cloth, which acts as a resist. You can also use resins, or there are different things you can use, but we use wax.
Yeah, and then there's examples of batik, like I think mostly Japan, they use starch as a resist. It's like rice starches.
Yeah,
So there's a lot of different resists you can use. So normally it's wax.
So you have a master sketch before you start?
Yes, so many times we're working on photographs we've taken. Sometimes it's just out of our heads, but we do a drawing, a really detailed drawing, and it almost looks like a paint by number when we're finished, because we mark every area of color. So like if we have 4 different greens in it, we have G, G1, G2, G3, and we have it all marked out.
the hard work is the planning and the sequencing, the drawing, the sequencing, and the planning. Once you've got that down, it's kind of, that's the fun stuff.
Okay, so you say we, who does which? Who does what?
All
We
right,
both do.
I did that one.
Yeah.
But you both do all of it?
Yes.
We both do Betty, but I'm pointing across.
Yeah.
That one there is mine. That's mine. This is mine on the floor. The fourth one with the buster is Beth's. These 3 back here, which are pointillism and divisionism, are Beth's, which she's very unique work she's doing. The screen is mine. That's mine. This is Beth's. That's Beth's. That's mine. That's Beth's.
So do you guys ever collaborate on pieces?
Yes,
We have.
we have.
We did, when we first met, we did a screen together.
We have a
panel
house in
screen.
India. We drew it together, working
Yeah.
from different sides, and then Betty we stopped at that. Actually, Betty brought us together. It's a good story. I can bore you. I was living in India. I got a house in India years ago. Beth was here.
Well, Kachera.
I just come out of a really bad relationship, and I was through with women, and I was looking for a spiritual, celibate, solitary kind of life. And then this young woman from Colorado emailed me to say, "Oh, I love your portraits. I saw them online. How do you do it?" Okay, all right. So we corresponded, and then we emailed for a year, and then she flew to London Heathrow. I flew to London Heathrow. We met at Heathrow Airport. Hit it off, spent 2 weeks together, we hit it off. She came back to Colorado. I packed up India and followed her over, and that was 20 years ago.
21 years ago.
21 years ago. We've been married 20 years now.
So.
We speak a private language, I would say, almost between us. Nobody else really is in Betty like we are.
But you were already doing the tea?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. I was living in Kitchener, Colorado. I had a gallery there, a little shop, and I was doing hand-painted clothing back in the 80s. And then I thought, well, I'll start dyeing the clothing. Then I thought, what's that thing I did in 7th grade with the wax? And then I melted some candles, and I just started playing with it. And I just fell in love, because it's like magic as the image appears, as you're doing the layers of wax and dye. I still look at it and think magic. Even when I have a student doing it, I'm leaning over going,
The thing is, as you go into a piece, you get more and more lost. As more wax goes on and darker colour, there's a point where you have no idea what you've got. And you're kind of winging it at the end, and then the wax comes off, and then there's a popping moment when the contrast with the light and dark makes sense, and it works, or maybe it doesn't.
Maybe it
work.
doesn't, yeah.
Hopefully it works.
You take the wax off each layer, each time?
No, at the end.
Yeah, I mean, you can do that. You can do that. We do that rarely, though. But you can do it to get different effects. But mostly we keep the wax on through the whole process.
So you really don't know what you get?
No, it gets very convoluted, yes. Yeah. And I'm always looking at it in the light, trying to figure out what I have. And you really don't know till the wax comes off.
And I have to say, there is no mastery in this technique. I've done it nearly 60 years. I make bloops and mistakes every single one I do. There's always a flaw. You may not see them, but I can point you out the flaws on everything here.
Is there a way to correct? Like,
No, once the wax is on,
no.
you've got to live with it.
okay.
Yeah. You have to be accepting of what you end up with. Yeah.
It's not for everyone. It's very slow. It takes a special person who can take a scene, take it apart tonally, and then put it back together in a manageable sequence. And not everybody has the patience. It's not like action painting where you go splat, splat, splat. So that looks pretty good now. It's like doing this kind of work is very precise work, and it's very hard to do.
Do you remember a piece that particularly shocked you when you finally saw it?
Everyone. Always.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
real
it
surprise.
it is usually a surprise because the little things happen. There's so many variables with the dye and the wax. I mean, even the temperature, the air temperature where you're working has an effect on dyes and wax. Your wax mixture, what wax you might have bought, there's just
And the number of times we bought cloth,
Mm.
they told us it's 100%. Oh yes, absolutely 100%. 100% wool. Oh yes, that's it. And you realize it's got some kind of fiber or something in it.
Yeah.
And the colors go gray.
Well, they wash
Awful.
out because the dyes we use, you can only use unnatural fiber. So a lot of times we've been fooled. Well, not a lot of times. A couple of times
Couple
we've
of
been
times
fooled.
we've made real mistakes.
We've made mistakes. Yeah, with that.
Is the cloth stretched on something?
Yeah.
Yes, we have frames, but with smaller pieces, we also work on boards with parchment paper because then the wax doesn't stick to the paper, so we can move them around.
Doesn't the fabric really even taut?
Not always, no. Mm-mm.
I mean, usually when I'm working large these days, I move it along as I go. I'm working on a bit, then I shift it, then I work on this bit, then
Yeah, and like Indonesian batik, they just
the whole
hold it. It's
thing in their
loose.
hand
It's
like this.
hanging. Yeah.
And in Indonesia, women do all the waxing. Men do not wax at all. Men do all the dyeing, women don't do the dyeing. So it's sort of kind of what that means exactly.
I'm curious about, I don't know a lot about batik, but I think of, traditional patterns, very pattern-based, repetitive.
Done with stamps.
With the chops, yeah.
And so, but the work you're doing is freehand and landscapes and
This is kind of art
portraits
batik,
and everything.
not
And so
traditional.
are many people doing this kind of thing?
Fewer
Yes.
than, there are some.
Yeah, there are some, but fewer than traditional batik and using the chops and there's huge factories. I mean, you see the cloth in clothing and
Malaysia.
stores where you could buy yardage, mass-produced, yeah.
Is
We
black
don't.
always the last color?
Or dark blue, or the darkest color.
Whatever the darkest color, maybe. I mean, like the darkest color was, I think I did this a long time ago. I think I just dripped red down it. So that was the last color on that. So
This is a fairly toxic process, yes?
toxic? Yes. Yeah. Well, we have a lot of ventilation in the studio for the wax fumes. So far, we don't have. You've been doing it for 60 years. You don't have any ill effects from it. And the dye is, you don't want to breathe in the powder dye, but once it's liquid, it's
it a
Not so
Procyon dye?
Yes.
Yes, Procyon MX cold water. It's got to be cold water dyes too, because hot dyes will melt the wax.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm curious about the shape of the tools that you had, you were holding up, and you said that you gifted.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So there's a container.
If you scoop the wax,
Okay.
pick it up, then it runs out.
And what I forgot-
Same principle,
Yeah.
but just
Same
from
principle.
different places.
And one thing I forgot to bring was Jonathan's invention, which is the half a tennis ball, which we always have in our left hand, both right-handed, because when you pick it up out of the wax, it's just drip, 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 dripping. So you go into your tennis ball, and then you do the work you want to do, and go straight back in your tennis ball when you're finished, so it's not dripping all over the place. And then what's nice about the tennis ball not using a rag, which is what I used to use, is that you can get the wax out and put it back in the pot. So we don't waste so much wax that way.
It's my greatest contribution.
It is, the half a tennis ball.
The half tennis ball. Okay. This didn't get hung in the show, but it was such a major piece for me that I thought we'd show it and talk about it. So we have a house in a small Himalayan village in India. There's maybe 120 people in the village, and I've drawn and painted all of them. So I've done a lot of portraits. So these are 1, 2, 3, 7 of them. I sent them to a show in Malaysia. They vanished. I waited a year. I kept begging, send my art back, send my. They came back, and they were kind of stained and ripped, and they'd been left hanging out in the rain as far as I could tell, or that's what it looked like. So I thought they were a write-off. And then we have a friend called Helen Godden, who's an Australian quilter, very well known. And she said, oh no, I can save them. So I gave them to her. She took them off to Australia. She made a quilt out of them. Saying you can't see the damage. She really saved them. So we put the quilt in the Houston International Quilt Show, won first prize. Then it went to Australia and won first prize in Sydney at the quilt show. So this I don't know. What's been interesting for me is that the villages are changing. The village is changing. People are dying. I've somehow managed to record a part of northern India which would have been lost. Traditional clothes. And what he hasn't got traditional clothes. This is my postman. And I said, I'm going to draw you. Come by. And he came by the next day wearing his best shirt. And I remember looking at it and thinking, oh my God, how am I going to do that? But I did it in the end. This is a beggar on the street who was perfectly happy, blissfully happy, with a can saying MIT on it. This is Sita from our village. This is a father and son from the village. This is Danu on the top left-hand corner, who used to do jobs for us, work with us. This is Harak Singh, who's a schizophrenic and is dead now. But I've got 2 or 3 portraits of him. This is Uncle, who's a retired academic from Delhi University who was living in our neighborhood.
So we were in Paris 2 years ago, and so we were taking photographs of the puddles, and so the pigeon happened to be in one. And so this is all the reflection. And I'm really proud of this one because technically I felt I did well, because it was a real headache to do, trying to keep this straight. But anyway, I'm very happy with it, and I hope that it looks like what it is. And I kind of wonder if it comes across as the whole thing being a reflection. Does it? Good. Okay. Okay. This is a relatively new piece, and so I've been doing a lot of exploring. We like to walk up by these beaver ponds in Cachera, Colorado, and so I've been taking a lot of photos and exploring the leaves floating and the reflections. And so this is where this came from. And when I was doing it, I thought, I'll put a border on. So,
I actually think art should speak for itself. I can't possibly talk about art. I can talk about what's going on, or the circumstances, or the story, but I cannot talk about art. So this was again from our Paris trip 2 years ago. We spent a couple of weeks just walking from one end. I know Paris really well from years, and we walked backwards and forwards, and we walked along the Seine, and we came round the corner, and suddenly there was a model being photographed, and I shot a lot of pictures. They didn't even see me there. I shot a lot of pictures. There's the Eiffel Tower back there. It was the rainy season. All the colours were rather grey. That's also in Beth's piece. All the colours were kind of greyed out from the rain, and it comes across a bit. And we were under one of the bridges, so I put that in as a silhouette. Technically, I suppose it is quite tricky, but white to grey to blue to two greys to painting a bit of blue in here, the background, different colours, and then black to frame the whole thing.
So you think about creating depth. This, by its nature, would seem like that would be difficult.
Well, depth is only big cows and small cows. They're all cows.
Fading the colors, right?
Yes, you're right. I made these subtler. I wanted the colours at the front stronger and so on. And these are a little filmy at the back, I suppose. I painted in these colours at the back. That crack is a bad crack. What I like the cracking is when the wax cracks and the dye gets into the cracks, and it does give it a batty look. But I wouldn't do a portrait in which there's a crack across the face. It would spoil it. And that's the Eiffel Tower, which I got in clearly, but the crack has lost it a little bit there. It does, I think it unifies batiks, the cracking, and it can be used to enhance them if it's subtle.
So this one is also from our Paris trip. So it's also very and so to get these walls, I did again a wash of color before I waxed it, instead of just working light to dark and waxing. And also I loved her because of her red pigments. Yeah, I think that makes it. So I started doing the pointillism a few years ago. And this is the first pointless portrait that I did. And this is where we were going to India, and they have a carnival there because it was Portuguese colony, so there's this funny mix Hinduism and Catholicism. And so there's the parade and all the celebration is very colorful. But she was a girl on the float. And I took her photo, and in thinking I needed to do a batik of her, and I did that. So one thing I learned with doing the pointillism is to make the faces and the things I really want to stand out. I've done a lot of using water drops on them too. So I used the kitski, the little tool that they use for the Ukrainian Easter eggs. You can get really fine dots. And so I did that for her face, but nothing else. I used the larger chanting for everything else, so her face really pops out. And I've done that. I can do water drops on cookies. Those are all like the chanting, the tiny dots. And so this is a very meditative process doing dots. You have to have the right music on because you don't want to go too fast or too slow. And I only do in the winter because that's when I have the time and I have good time in. There's a couple of weeks where I can just every day go and dot. And so I really love doing it. I love the effect. I love the light and the shading that I get with it that you don't get with regular batik. So this is also was pointillism is divisionism, and I started using dashes instead of dots because then you can get some direction and some movement with it. And so I don't know if anybody's been to La Vida, but this is Gimmer's Butte, which is Sangre de Cristo's in the background, and a little ranch house down here. And so I've been doing more with the dashes and playing with that movement that I can get with it.
That's what Van Gogh did, of course. Little individualist strokes like that.
Yeah.
It does show
So this is just
fantastic movement.
dashes of wax over layers of color.
Also known as Rattlesnake Butte, I believe.
Or King Kong.
King
But
Kong?
everybody has different names for it. It depends on what angle you look at it. Last time we were in India, we went to a tiger reserve, and when we were looking for tigers, we were bouncing around the back of the jeep for a whole day looking for tigers, and we didn't find any, but we saw lots of elephants. And I'd never seen elephants in the wild acting like elephants. And I could just watch them all day long. And so I've done quite a few of the teeth of the elephants. And so this one is kind of fanciful because I threw the flowers in. I was walking down a path, and a tribute to them. I just love them.
And I just love to see there was so much going on there. What the red rose, what the guy in the kid in the red shirt and bicycle, this other kid having some dialogue, something going on back where this guy bending down to his butt, illuminated, and he's collecting water in these bottles to sell water. And this is I guess this is my point. I'm not really committed to it, but I thought that was the way to go. I've always liked it, but it's very graphic. But there's a story. I do like stories in that. Two pieces here which kind of relate. I've got macular degeneration. I'm losing my eyesight. And I haven't let it faze me in the slightest, but I have adapted. So I'm working larger in both of these, and I'm playing with color. Color has become much more important to me. I can't see the details. I can't do the details anymore. So it has changed my work, and I am adapting. And we kind of like them. They're looser. I haven't got the control. I have much more control here 3 years ago than I have down here now. This is the same. It kind of works because the colors are good. And I'm trying, for instance, orange and purple and no complementary colors. I'm trying to use complementary colors, pink and green, strange colors like that. So it's kind of working. I'm still enjoying work.
So this is a triptych idea. How do you feel? I like the idea of looking at it from a distance, a little closer. Probably should have done more. This one I put away, so I wasn't sure what to do with it. And I wasn't sure whether I should frame them separately together. So anyway, I came out with the idea of doing a shadow box. I'm real happy with it. And I think I'd like to do more, explore this a little bit more. Distance to close.
Well, and now for something completely different. Many months ago, probably about a year ago, when we were talking about doing this show, I went down to La Vida to visit Jonathan and Beth. I knew them previously. And I said, we ought to talk about what's the theme of the show. And we batted around a few ideas. And I said to them, well, so what's happening in your psyches and the inner life, and what kind of themes are emerging in your work? And they both looked at me kind of blankly and they said, we don't work like that. And it was an interesting education for me. I very much do work that way, but not everyone does. Artists have a variety of different methods, and they're very prolific. They're very narrative. Sculpture is not so much narrative. Sculpture is more about the immediate impact of the form on you when you see it across the room. You can't really tell as much of a story in sculpture unless you have multiple figures, and even then, it's still about, wow, look at the way that all goes together, So I'm going to talk a little bit about the theme of playful resistance. And I think there's a question that arises immediately with that theme, which is, what are we resisting? And I think we resist anything that doesn't give us life, anything that doesn't bring vitality or doesn't seem truthful to us. Even instinctually, I think we want to resist that. And from an early age as children, we find ways of doing that. Children that they've observed in studies, if they are in an abusive type situation or some kind of restrictive situation, children will play act the situation and enact themselves being more empowered and getting out of the situation through their own strategies. So we start this very early, and I think we continue it. We do it in a number of ways. Just last night, I was in the King Soopers up on Centennial, and there was this guy doing his grocery shopping. He was in a kind of a Buster Keaton clown outfit in one of the electric carts. He wasn't disabled, because I saw him get up out of the cart and go get something and then get back into it. And he had Latino music blasting in his cart. And he was just kind of bopping around the store, you know. And it just so delighted me, because I thought, well, he's resisting the monotony of grocery shopping, you know. I think a lot of people in the modern age are resisting gender conformity. One of my sculptures has to do with that. And I think humor in political resistance, there's just many ways that we do this. And I think doing it through play is the most effective, because the play is an enactment and it gets into us and it changes us, I think, more fully than just an analysis would. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about a few of my works, not every single one of them, and talk about how I think it fits the theme, where that came from for me. And then I'll talk a little bit about the process of making a bronze, which is also a very ancient process. And it has been done, you know, by the Egyptians and later cultures after that. And we still do it exactly the same way. The technology really hasn't changed much at all. So I want to start by talking about the Eternal Fiesta, which is the tall woman on stilts in the back who is in a Day of the Dead costume. And most of you know about Day of the Dead, so I won't describe it in great detail, but it's a holiday in Mexico that is very important. It comes around the time of Halloween for us, and the 1st and 2nd of November, where there's a belief that one's ancestors can return. And you prepare a kind of an altar called an ofrenda, which has things on it that pertain to the deceased person, foods that you think that person's spirit would enjoy when it returns. And children are given little candy skulls with their names on it. And there's a playful, kind of defiant, but at the same time reverent attitude towards death. And I think, you know, the fear of death is, of course, a universal for us as humans. And this is a way of sort of trying it on in a playful way, so that when it comes, it's kind of familiar. And there's a lot of community ritual and a cleaning of the grave sites. And so there's a bonding of the community through creating a sense of wonder about death rather than a fear of it. I read a really interesting article recently that said, you know, maybe happiness is not the thing we should be pursuing. Maybe wonder is a healthier kind of. A lot of the work in this gallery that I did for this show is a way of honoring various Colorado Springs creatives. Several of the local folks who are circus performers or life models have modeled for me so that I could create these sculptures. I always work from life, not from photographs, because this is a three-dimensional medium. I need a three-dimensional reference in order to really capture, I think, the form. So that sculpture is of a woman named Elizabeth Fluharty, who is an aerial silks performer and an acrobat. And I saw a photo of her in that costume, and I just immediately thought, I have to sculpt that. The butterflies are a common symbol. They are an Aztec symbol of resurrection and the return of ancestors. And it just so happens that the monarch butterfly migration coincides with Day of the Dead in Mexico. So there's a much, if you've been to Mexico, you know there's a lot of conglomeration of the Spanish Catholic traditions with the indigenous traditions, and it's created its own unique thing. So, Eternal Fiesta, that one's, I really am happy about that. Backbone. Oh, certainly, yeah.
Was the model in that costume when you were?
Well, not at first. I had her model in the nude for me so that I could study and get the anatomy correct, and then in the costume. She insisted on modeling on the stilts, and I said, really, you don't have to do that. And mostly she didn't. Mostly she was standing on the floor, and then I just added the stilts as a last piece. In bronze casting, something like that cannot all be poured at one time. Bronze is a metal that doesn't pour very readily, the way gold or silver would. So that was done in 6 different pieces and then had to be welded together and, yeah, patinated once that was all done.
Well, also.
I do some welding, although that one was welded at the foundry. Big scale welding. I leave to them. It's you have to use TIG welding, not MIG welding. MIG is kind of sloppy, and for fine art, you need a more precise kind of welding. So backbone has a very different patina on it. You can use a variety of chemicals to patinate bronze. This is a silver nitrate, so it's actual silver in the chemical mix, and cobalt creates the marbleizing on it. Thematically, this is really about my own personal journey with self-confidence, which has been a long road for me. This figure is lifting herself up by the hair, you know, trying to develop some backbone. When I first brought the wax to the foundry, one of the guys that I work with there looked at it and he said, "What did she do, rip the spine out of some poor guy?" And I said, well, yeah, maybe. So she's sitting on a spinal column, 2 spinal columns. Actually, I had hiking one day in my neighborhood, I actually found a deer carcass where the entire pelvis and spinal column was intact. And of course I took it home because I love bones. I'm a sculptor, so I sculpted the bones with that as a reference and had her sitting upon that. The portrait in the back, maybe we should turn. This is called Two-Spirit Courage. A two-spirit is one of the many Native American terms for a non-binary individual. In many indigenous cultures of the North American Indians, non-binary people or transsexual people were considered sort of special and sacred, that they brought together important things in the human psyche. And I think there's a lot of exploration of this clearly, you know, in our world now, and a lot of emergence of the fluidity of our identities with a lot of resistance in response to it. And I think people in the trans community are really on the front line of this change that has to do not only with our gender, but with just the entire permission that we're, I think, as a species, trying to give ourselves to be more whole and less pigeoned into particular roles and identities. So I think that people who are expressing that are quite courageous and resistant to the boxes that others would want to put them in. Seduction is the little piece up in front here. So this is an Eve and a serpent, and I've always found that myth in the Bible to be greatly misinterpreted. I think what happens for me in that myth is that through insisting on eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, Eve essentially sets the entire process of civilization in motion. Because then they have children, and their children have children, and they have to leave the garden and go off and colonize. And so it's really almost like the creation of civilization. And this piece is playful in the sense that it's like a bit difficult to tell who is seducing whom. The serpent is trying to seduce her, but she's also kind of got a look on her face like, oh yeah, let's talk, I get a kick out of that piece. It has a beautiful piece of Spanish Rojo Alicante marble, which comes from the town of Alicante, Spain, on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast.
So how did you choose the model for that one? Serving the theme?
This one, sometimes the theme and the composition come together long after I actually sculpt the human. So I think this was just a life session, and it was a reclining pose the model was doing, and I sculpted that, and I thought, it's kind of boring. What would I do with it? And then I thought, well, let me elevate it on something, and next thing I knew, it was sort of seeing these serpent-like forms, and she became an Eve elevated by the temptation, really. The process of composition can take, I usually spend about 15 or 20 hours with the human model, and then maybe another 30 or 40 hours after that, deciding on compositional and thematic finishing touches to the piece.
So you had one where you had the concept first?
Yes.
When you saw a photo?
Yes. Yes, and I altered, obviously I altered that a bit too, along the way. One of the things that I think is important as an artist is, you're composing and you're creating right up until the thing is finished, right? You're not done until it's in the gallery. I was going to go over to this one next, and then because I brought the example of her, then I'll move to talking about bronze casting in a general way. So this I call Hypatia of Alexandria. Most people have never heard of her. She was a mathematician, astronomer, philosopher in 4th century Alexandria. We don't really have her works. They've been lost, except for some works we presume must have been made by her, but we're not certain. But she was a highly respected teacher in her day, and I see her as a symbol of resistance in the sense that she was neither a pagan nor a Christian. This was the era when Cyril, the bishop of Alexandria, was kind of trying to have more power in the political arena. And Hypatia was highly influential, both in Athens and in Alexandria, with the prefect there. And so eventually she was murdered because of the fear that she had too much influence. But what she was mostly known for and admired for was her temperance and her character, her integrity. She refused to adhere strictly to any particular school of thought in philosophy. She was open to all, and her idea was she wanted truth. And I guess it's a figure that I admire historically. So she's fragmented, partly because the way she died, we think, is by having her body sort of torn apart by many people attacking her, which is, not a happy thing to think about. But I played a little bit with this one in the sense of it's an extremely classical form, but I put a very unclassical patina on it. I was thinking of Yves Klein, the artist who invented this electric blue cobalt color, I think back in the 1960s. And he did a series of works that all had that color. And I thought, let's just see what a body looks like in cobalt. Yes.
How do you, what's the patina?
What is it?
Yeah.
In this case, it's like raw earth oxides. Most of the time, it's chemicals like ferric nitrate, or whites are achieved with bismuth and titanium. It's not painted. You need to bring the piece up to a high heat so that the oxides will adhere to it. Usually you spray them on. And occasionally, like some of the detail on the Eternal Fiesta piece would be painted with a brush because it is so delicate. But mostly it's a spray, and then there's a chemical reaction with the bronze. The bronze that's used for sculpture, statuary, is almost exclusively copper. It's a little bit of manganese, a little bit of zinc, maybe a little silica too, but it's like 95% copper. So generally, whatever patinates copper will do that to bronze as well, but there are some tricks to it. It's quite scientific. Well, let me show you a little bit of how do you get from idea to bronze. The reason bronze sculptors don't produce like 100 bronzes in a year is because it just takes a lot of time and a lot of steps. Generally, one starts with a soft material like either clay or wax. I like clay, just like handling clay better. And I use these oil-based clays, which are primarily wax and petroleum mixtures. You need some kind of an armature. Generally, we use aluminum because it doesn't work harden the way other metals will, so you can bend it easily even after clay is on it. And I actually sculpted this entire piece with a head and feet and everything. And she's going to be in another show coming up soon up in Loveland. And once you make the mold of your piece, you can take the clay apart and just use it again for another sculpture. So I started taking the clay apart, and I looked at this fragment and I thought, I kind of like the fragment too, you know? So then I made a mold of the fragment. The mold making process is done either with silica or urethane, not polyurethane, just urethanes, rubbers, and they come in generally 2 parts that you have to mix with a catalyst. And so they're pasty, liquidy when you paint them on, and then they cure. I like silica because it's not toxic the way the urethanes are, and it lasts longer too. The urethanes just kind of want to be liquid on our planet. So after a number of years, they will break down and liquefy. I guess eventually the silicone would too, but much longer time period. You can handle this. You can't hurt it in any way. I'll pass it around. This product, yeah, that's the only part of. Historically, there wouldn't have been silica, right? They would have made their molds historically out of plaster. Okay, and then you can cast into that. As you can see, it's very flimsy, right? So it's not going to hold anything that you pour into it. So you need something called a mother mold. And the mother mold is created once this entire thing is coated with all the coats of rubber that you need. You then have to make a plaster mold to hold it. Then you cut it apart, and then you've got this, and you can pour things into this and get the right form. What's generally poured into it to create the bronze is wax. And I'll pass this around too. This wax is hollow because what the foundry does is they will take this hollow wax. It's about 1/4 of an inch thick. If you did a solid bronze, it would weigh tons, and you would never want to pick it up. So, and you also just don't want to use that much metal if you don't have to. There's no need to because it's very stable, just 1/4 inch thick. The foundry will then take this wax and they will make another mold, which is a silica-based shell. And they'll pour that shell both inside this piece and outside of it so that it will be a hollow form. And then they will put this wax covered with the shell into a kiln, and all the wax will melt out, and you'll be left with the hollow of the form, and then that can support the pouring of molten bronze into it. That mold is lost every time you cast. So this is the only permanent thing that I have of the piece, and I can cast, maybe 100, 200 pieces out of this if I want to. The wax is lost, and the shell is lost. So that's why it's called the lost wax casting technique. Okay? What's that? Well, it looks like bubble gum. It does. I wish I could use chewed bubble gum. It'd be a lot cheaper. So when the bronze comes out of the cast, it looks like this. You see it's kind of rough. This is not actually my piece. This is a piece by a friend of mine named Tim Nimmo, another wonderful sculptor here in town. He does abstractions of animals. If you want to come up and take a look at this later, this is a little heavy, so I won't pass it around. You can see it's got these rough areas. Those are where sprues have to be attached in order for the bronze to be poured and for it to flow into this form. So this is all about metallurgy. When you do a casting, the largest piece is going to suck metal crystals. Metal is crystalline, okay, from the smaller pieces. And so you want your largest piece to be the thing where you want the metal to be good, so it doesn't have pits and bubbles and things like that in it. I can pass a small piece of this around. And as you can see, that couldn't be cast all in one piece either. It had to be chopped. It's just the nature of the way bronze and metal flows. And I do small, I don't pour the bronze myself. That's kind of caveman work, you know? I mean, you got to have a large pit and a crucible that takes, 3 guys to pour. And I do small scale casting in silver and gold because I've been a goldsmith for a long time. So it's the same exact process, but just easier to do scale wise. Yes, go ahead.
Put inside?
It's like a sandy kind of shell.
Is that the same stuff as the ceramic shell on the outside?
Yes. Exactly. And you can see, if you look at that wax, you can see it has a lot of flaws in it, right? It has seams, it has maybe some bubbles. So before that can go through the shell process, it has to be chased, we call it. You have to fix the wax up exactly as you want it. And then after the casting is done, you have to chase the metal. You have to, knock off any sprues, fix any bubbles by TIG welding a little bit of material in there, grind off the seams, etc. Just get that all cleaned up. And then you can put the patina on it, which, as I say, involves heat and chemicals.
Sorry,
No.
So once you have the ceramic shell in there and you have the bronze encasing it, how do you get all of what's inside the bronze out, or you just leave it in?
How do you get the inside shell out? They will sprue to the wax part, so that's got to remain open like somewhere, right, for that wax to pour out. And then once the bronze is cast, they just break it off. They just, and because the bronze is in pieces, they can get the inside part out too, because it's not all encased. Does that make sense? Yeah. Good question, though. Yeah.
The TIG welding aspect you're talking about, is that something that are you closing the piece that's open that the process came from? What is the TIG welding part of it?
So you'll weld a leg or an arm back on if it was cast separately. When you do a casting, it's never perfect. So sometimes it'll get a little bit of porosity, like it'll be a little pitted, so you'll have to TIG weld a little bit of metal material into those cavities and then grind off any positives that are left. That's the lengthiest part of the process, is the metal chasing, and the dirtiest too, I think. So this is called Fire Within, and also a local Colorado Springs creative, a woman named Nicole Cooper, modeled for me for this. I guess I don't have a lot to say about her except that she's conveying the idea of one's inner passions being expressed. Jonathan and Beth are very much about stories. I am more about the inner life. And, both ways of being are really good. But So to me, it's what you develop on the inside, what you think about, what you feel, what you absorb from others in your world that then constitutes your essence, I guess, is the way I would say it. This woman actually literally spins fire. She literally juggles fire batons. So that's partly why the idea came to me to use her for that.
What's the patina used for that?
That is several coats of ferric nitrate in differing dilutions. So some of the gold parts would be more diluted. And then you always lacquer and wax a bronze as the very final touch to make it weatherproof and to last the years. This particular one has a red lacquer put on it. So that intensified the ferric color, yeah. I wouldn't ordinarily use that, but in her case, I thought it was appropriate. Usually just a clear, like a spray clear lacquer, yeah. And then you use a paste wax over that and buff that out. So, different kinds of shines that you can put on it. Thank you. I kind of like that one too. This is my dog, Max, who died in February. So I actually did have him model for me while I was, he did a good job. He was old and he was tired, so he didn't mind just kind of lying on a model stand while I sculpted him in clay. About these pieces, but they also, to me, express a certain kind of resistance. I'll just this one called Tenderness here. I think this is a kind of anti-modern countercultural piece. I hear the term badass woman used a lot these days, and recently somebody saw that sculpture of the Day of the Dead figure, and she said, "Well, you're a badass, Mama Jamma," is what she called me. And when I objected to the term, she thought it was because I wasn't receiving the compliment, and it wasn't that. It was more that, like, if you're a badass woman, power to you, But do we all have to be edgy all the time? I don't think so. Sometimes I think there's the gentle aspect of being human, the slowness, the vulnerability. I mean, I think we do a lot of things to avoid the reality that we're vulnerable. And I think acknowledging our vulnerability to one another and being with each other in that is valuable and comforting, because it's real, Yes, Deb.
I do see your work as very, this the narrative of the spirit, and it talks about that very deeply in its piece, but also the other language and all that. It all comes together and creates a very strong statement.
Thank you. I'm glad if that's true.
I just see each of yours as a story within, where maybe the petites are a story of what's around.
Oh.
What's around you.
Yeah.
Or yours is a story of what's inside.
The inside and the outside, like even this little piece here, this little Artemis piece. I've done this in a variety of patinas, and some of them I put these designs on and some I leave blank. So I learned recently by studying some petroglyphs in Wyoming that were done by the Shoshone sheep eater people, that these figures like spirals and lines and circles and dots, these are biological occurrences in the human eye. They're called phosphenes. And it's thought that when people would do vision quests, and they would fast for 3 or 4 days without food and water, they would start to see these naturally, just biologically, and then they would interpret them. And so the petroglyphs have these markings, and children make these markings, and adults make them doodling, and so they're just in us. And I think, there's something very primordial about just basic markings that feels good to make, good to do, you know. It's fun, you know, I mean, I think potters and patinators have to be the chemists of the art world, right? They're the ones that create color. You know, a bit with the batiks too, but they don't make the dyes, right? The way potters have to really figure out how all those chemicals work to produce color. Color is a mysterious and fascinating thing. Love rocks. I do also carved stone, and that's a different process. That's a very different psychological process. Slower. Usually you work from a model. You'll have something you want to reference that you've created in plaster or clay or something. But then that subtractive thinking is quite confusing. And every sculptor I know who carves stone, there's a point in doing the piece where you can't figure out where to carve next. And the only thing to do is to just let it go for a couple of days and come back to it. And, you know, then your brain will work it out somehow. But it's like there's an immersion in a three-dimensional form that kind of requires that it almost sculpts you, is kind of the way I think of it. You got to slow down and let it do that. And so,